author, former Standard Times reporter Maureen Boyle. She's written a riveting book called Shallow Graves. It is a non-fiction account of the New Bedford highway killings. Starting in 1988, 9 bodies were found on the sides of highways in the region. 2 other women were reported missing but never found. This book is really a retelling of what happened in the investigation, focusing mainly on the police who carried out that investigation and the families of several of the victims. This book centers on the city of New Bedford in the late 80s and early 90s, and honestly, it's hard to put down. Welcome, Maureen. Congratulations, number one, on raising awareness about this horrendous crime after almost 30 years that sadly does remain unsolved, and 2, for writing a wonderful book about it, and a very detailed and interesting book, especially if you're from this part of the world here.
I appreciate the very kind words, Jim, especially from you.
Well, that's they're well-deserved, believe me. You were the primary reporter on the story. It took you more, though, than 20 years to write this book. How did it happen? What prompted you to write this book?
Because time had passed, I found that people were more willing to talk about the case, to be a little bit more honest about what had happened, what had transpired. They weren't influenced by politics, and the families, I really think the families deserve some answers. So hopefully this book will focus more on the case, renewed interest in the case, and urge people to come forward.
This book has, as I said, it's really hard to put down because it's, especially if you're local, you kind of know these people, you know the locations, and as I've often wondered when I drive by some of these spots, I say, why here? Why did this person leave bodies here? Persons are persons. It's just it's been an ongoing thought in my mind for 29 years, like it has, I'm sure, in yours.
Yeah, well, many times, I mean, I still, as I'm driving down 140 or on 195, I do find myself looking along the side of the highway, wondering if the 2 missing women are out there someplace. It really is haunting.
You left the Standard Times, I believe, in the early 90s. You went on to...
late 90s.
Late 90s, okay. And then you went to Brockton.
Yes, to the Enterprise in Brockton.
Yep. And now you head the journalism department at Stonehill College. Did you keep in contact with those police officers off and on? And did family members, did they urge you?
I kept in touch with a lot of the family members. One of the reasons why I chose, when I left the Standard Times, that I went to Brockton, to the Brockton paper, is because one of the victims was originally from Brockton, so I knew I could continue to report on the case. Occasionally, I would run into some of the investigators in the case when I was working up in Brockton. So I've always tried to maintain a very professional, respectful relationship both with victims and all members of law enforcement.
What was the most difficult part of writing a book like this? And I imagine with passage of time, look, I know you took a lot of notes and a lot of good notes, but with passage of time, sometimes memories fade a little bit, and you've got to go and recheck with people. Probably more than once. Yeah,
I did interview and re-interview a number of people. Some people that I interviewed who are not directly quoted in the book, I talked with them just to double-check a fact. I also relied heavily on some reports that I had that were able to give me specific dates and times to refresh people's memories and to really give exact times and dates of specific settings.
Were most people cooperative, Maureen?
For the most part, yes. With all but 1 or 2 exceptions, everyone was very, very cooperative, very forthcoming, very, very honest. And then when they looked back on the investigation, what was done, what wasn't done, they're very honest about what they wish had been done. And part of what they wish had been done was they wish they had the technology of today back then. There's a uniform sense of that, yes, the crime would have been solved today due to technology.
Investigators Marianne Dill and Josie Gonsalves are really key figures in this book because they talked with you, I'm sure, during the investigation, but they also were free with their time after.
Yes.
And the follow-up and interviews that you did.
As were many of the investigators.
Okay. Are they frustrated as some people are? I know I'm frustrated about it and how nothing seemed to happen once the charges were dropped against Ken Pont. Nothing.
Well, that isn't quite true. I mean, just because we don't know that what law enforcement was doing, that doesn't mean nothing was done. There was some forensic testing done under, later administrations. It just wasn't a big show about it. But I would say all of the investigators were very, very frustrated that they weren't able to arrest and convict the killer, as well as not locate the remaining two victims.
Yeah. You're listening to Townsquare Sunday. My name is Jim Phillips, and my guest is Maureen Boyle, the author of Shallow Graves, the story of the New Bedford highway killings. Attorney Ken Pont was the only person ever charged in connection with the highway killings. The charges were later dropped when a new district attorney was elected, and his name was Paul Walsh. He named a special prosecutor to look at the case. After a period of weeks, the charges against Pont were dropped for lack of evidence. While the previous DA, Ron Pina, apparently liked Pont as a suspect, even the investigators were unsure about Pont's guilt, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. When you looked at the evidence that they had, there really wasn't enough to convict. The general feeling was if it went to trial, that a judge would have thrown it out before it even went to trial.
And that leads you to wonder just how much did anyone have? I mean, there were other...
Yeah, there's a
other
number
people
of
who looked better, didn't they? At least by their past MOs.
Yeah.
According to the book, Pont's attorney Kevin Reddington told Pont while he was under indictment not to talk with the media.
Yeah,
Keep your mouth shut,
yes.
I think is the quote.
Yeah.
Mr. Pont repeatedly ignored the advice, calling the police, calling the paper, calling the radio stations and TV stations, attacking Ron Pina, but not always going on the record.
Yeah.
He would always say, this is off the record. It was a very strange time, wasn't it?
Yes, it was very, very strange. I'm sure you also got some of those phone calls from Ken. He was an interesting character, to say the least. He
was, I think, a suspected drug user. Some might say a known drug user. He had at one time in his life, he had seemed to have straightened himself out and been a person who looked like he could climb a ladder of success to some degree, make a living. Contribute to society.
And say, he literally turned his life around because he had drug problems earlier in life, beat them, or so it appeared, went to finish school, college, went to law school, got his previous convictions expunged. He had it all. And then, unfortunately, addiction is not something that is easy for people to overcome.
Yeah, it's never easy to overcome, especially, I think, in those days, in the late 80s in New Bedford, where there was just a tremendous amount of heroin and cocaine in the city, and the addiction problems were everywhere. Some might say they're still here today, but obviously.
Yeah, and there wasn't an awful lot of treatment options, unfortunately. And people, while here in New Bedford, people were talking about addiction issues, a lot of the families were very, very embarrassed about it, and they didn't know where to turn and where to get their kids help.
There were other suspects that on the surface might appear to be people who could have committed these killings, Talk about them. First, Neil Anderson.
Neil Anderson had been arrested in a series of rapes involving prostitutes. He eventually was convicted. He was looked at as a suspect at one point. They looked very, very hard at him. There was a number of different people who came forward with a variety of stories, and none of them quite checked out. So they didn't have any evidence to charge him. There was Anthony DeGrazia, who was from Freetown, who had a previous record of sexual assaults. He had been arrested for a string of assaults on prostitutes. They did a number of testing on him of his vehicles, but never enough to charge.
Yeah, there was one later one that it appeared, at least in the book, that you could have probably got a conviction on. The victim fought her way out of the truck, broke the door handle, all of that. And
but that would have been for sexual assault, not murder.
Right, exactly. And then a short time later, after that alleged attack, DeGrazia committed suicide.
Around that time, it was after the charges against Ken Pont were dropped.
Yeah. Anybody else?
There was an individual from the Midwest who claimed that he was the killer, but he just made it up. There were a few other people that were seriously looked at. Their names never publicly came out, but there was never any evidence. And that's an issue here. They looked at a lot of people, but there was nothing that said this is the killer. And that's what's kind of scary, that when you think of it, they had so many suspects. And, you think, my goodness, there's so many people who could possibly be a killer in our midst.
Maybe. And now we've come to the realization here that that person, if that person or persons is alive, they could still be out there. At an advanced age, probably, but still be out there. In writing this book, Maureen, was your biggest frustration not being able to speak with the former district attorney, Ron Pina? Did he decline to be interviewed?
We had. I spoke with his daughter to get a view into what was going on in his home, and how her view on what was going on there and how he felt.
Yeah, and from what I remember reading, she was. She described her father as contemplating.
Yes, he was,
thinking hard.
Yeah, and I really think he was haunted by the case. That he really, really wanted to solve the case. So at the time, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, it was all politics." That he was using this as a vehicle for re-election or higher office. I really don't think that was the case.
I think if you put that kind of time into something, you want to see a conclusion.
Yes.
And
I don't think he could face the families and think, oh, this is just politics. He isn't that type of person.
So you are very close, I would say, to several families of victims. I know you've talked with them after the book was published at a recent event, for instance, in New Bedford. Some of those folks came to see you and hear what you had to say and maybe get a book signed. What are they saying about the book? What's the feedback you've been getting from?
Well, for the family members, obviously, it's a very, very different read for them because it is their life. It's very, very personal. And parts of it will be very hard for them to read. And I've told them that. And for some of them, I did have them advance read a couple of things for accuracy, so they knew what was in the book before it was published. This is not something that came as a big surprise to them, but it is still very difficult and very emotional for them because they're reliving what happened then. They're being transported right back to 1988.
That's very true. That book does transport you back as you are reading, especially again if you are a local person. Did you have some pressure, perhaps, not to write this book, or did no one?
No, there was never any pressure not to
Probably a clamor to write the book.
Yeah, well, never any pressure not to write the book. There was no one in the city saying, "Oh no, that'll harm the image of the city" or anything like that, because I don't think the book does.
I think it puts you back in 1988.
Yeah, and I think it shows something about the strength and resiliency of New Bedford.
Early report on book sales. What's the story? How's it going?
I haven't checked the numbers yet, so I don't know. I'm almost afraid. Yeah.
Don't be afraid.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid. This is a project that I know your heart was in, and you obviously put a lot of time into it as a reporter. And again, when you wrote this book.
Yeah. Well, it was also really nice to reconnect with a lot of people from 1988 and the early 90s who were involved in the investigation. And, I really appreciate all of their cooperation and the time that they spent with me in reliving that time.
Ken Pont always said, his first conversation with Bob St. Jean, I don't know if you recall in the book, but the first conversation was, invariably he'd ask, how's it going? That would be almost the first question. And secondly, he would say, well, it's probably a truck driver. Mm-hmm. It's probably a truck driver.
Or he would come up with all different types of what he had heard, right. As if he was cooperating.
Yeah, but they checked a lot of people.
Yes.
Who may have come into the city, including people with records of sexual assault.
Yes.
Who may have been on a release program from hospitals and all of those things. Those were all checked. If nothing else, and this book gives you a lot of other things, but it shows the depth of the police investigation.
Yeah. And that was. I thought I knew a lot about the case, but yet I also knew I didn't know everything, and I still don't know everything about the case. There's some pieces of evidence and information that only law enforcement knows, and rightly so. I was really amazed at the depth of the investigation, the sheer number of people that they interviewed, the different rabbit holes that they went down trying to find the killer.
And unfortunately, it didn't work out, but we certainly hope this book project will for you.
Yeah. Well, I hope that someone reading it will say, oh, this makes sense to me. Oh, this is the person that I recall was over there, or this person said this to me or that to me, and or confessed to an individual and they were afraid to come forward. So I hope that they do contact the DA's office to provide information.
My guest has been Maureen Boyle, one of the best crime reporters ever at the Standard Times. She has written a compelling account of the New Bedford highway killings. It's called Shallow Graves, and it's available in bookstores everywhere and places like Amazon as well. Publisher again?
University Press of New England. 4Edge is the imprint, and that's upne.com.
Maureen, good to see you again.
Oh,
Great to see you again.
And if anyone wants to reach out to me, they can reach out to me on Facebook through the Shallow Graves, the Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer. I have a Facebook page, I have an author page, or on Twitter, MEBoyle1. Just get in touch with me and go onto those pages and send me messages.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Best of luck for the book, Ruth.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim.